Scientifically, I think it's undeniable at this point to say that at conception, you have a completely unique genetic code, DNA, and I would say a unique human person. And so, where the debate has kind of pivoted to is it's undeniable that that's human, but when does that human become a person? And that's sort of the debate that as it exists today. And I think we need to actually go back to think about how our culture even approaches the issue of what even truth is as it would apply to something like morality, because that's really an ethical question. When is the human a person? That's a question of ethics. And so I'm building on the work of Francis Schaeffer and Nancy Pearcey here, but they sort of identified the way our culture approaches truth. So many people in our culture believe that truth is something that's relative to each person's historical context, environment, maybe even ethnicity, the time in which they lived. There's all these different factors that would make truth relative to each individual person. This is why in our culture, so often people will say things like, well, what's true for you is true for you, but what's true for me is true for me. And so what Schaefer and Piercy have really put their finger on is that people don't walk around like relativists in every area of life. There are certain things that everybody agrees are objectively true, and those would be in the categories of things like science, facts, logic. And so these would be seen as truths that are public truths. These are accessible to everyone. But then there's this sort of two-tiered approach to truth that our culture has. And what Schaefer and Piercy have pointed out is that we put things like the public truths, like facts, science, logic, in the bottom floor. But on the top tier, if you see it like a two-story house, on the second floor up above are things like preferences, opinions, and our culture has put ethics up there. Our culture has put morality in that sort of upstairs category. And so therefore, that's really a private truth. That's something that, morality is something really that's just a matter of opinion. But here's why I don't think that works. If morality, in other words, what we should and shouldn't do, is just a matter of opinion, then it really just comes down to power. It just comes down to whoever has the most influence, the most power, the loudest voice, the most ability to enact their view to decide what is actually morally good. But I think instinctively we all know that isn't the case. That doesn't work. Because, for example, if I have my phone in my hand, I've got my phone right here. So if I say, this is my phone, and a 250-pound linebacker comes in the room and says, no, that's my phone, and there's nobody in between us to stop him, well, whose phone is it going to be? It's going to be his phone, because I don't think I could probably fight him off. And so the question is, does that make it right? If his opinion is that he can take the phone and say it's his, but my opinion is, no, it's my phone, well, who decides between us? If there's no moral law above us to decide these things, well, then it just comes down to power. And I think deep down we all know that that doesn't work. And so as this would apply to morality, even within our public policy, often people will say, well, we shouldn't legislate morality. Well, I don't think that really works, because every law legislates morality. In fact, you hear people say, my body, my choice. Well, as it would apply to abortion, I don't think that works, because at conception, you have a completely unique genetic code that is not actually part of it's not your body. It's a different body with a different genetic code, a different DNA sequence. But let's even say, for argument's sake, that it is. Well, every law tells you what you can and can't do with your body. You can't take your body and go murder someone or rob a bank or shoot someone with a gun. You can't just go on a shooting rampage because that sounds fun to you. And that is using your body in a certain way that the law says, no, you can't do that with your body. You don't have the choice to do these things with your body. And so I think that fails. But ultimately, I think this is coming from the fact, what is being called the fact-value split. So we talked about that two-story house where you have objective truths, public truths on the lower floor, and then more opinions, preferences, ethics, and on the top floor. So Piercy and Schaeffer refer to this as the fact-value split. So you have facts on the bottom, values on the top. And as this would apply to the question, when is a human a person? Our culture has split the human person like this. So the public truth would be that it's human. But on the top tier would be the question of personhood. And so this is more a matter of opinion. This is sort of the fact value split as it would apply. And so this is really what is referred to as personhood theory. And personhood theory is just simply an outworking of that fact value split. So in other words, if we see it as that two-tiered view of truth, to be human is a biological fact, but to be a person is a value. It's an opinion of when you think this happens. But I think this fails because to be human is what gives you human rights. And this is a very similar argument that the Nazis used to devalue Jews, is this kind of taking away of their personhood. But I actually think this can be traced back to very ancient times. There was a group in very early Christianity that called themselves the Gnostics. And it even goes back to Platonism before that. But the Gnostics believed that the physical world, I mean, there was a lot going on in Gnosticism, so it's hard to just identify it as one monolithic thing. It certainly wasn't. But there was some agreement among different sects of Gnosticism. And one of the characteristics of that viewpoint was that physical matter was corrupted. It was evil. And so there was this separation of physical matter from the immaterial. So material versus immaterial world. And the material world was considered evil, corrupted. And so you wanted to transcend that. And I think we're still seeing the outworkings of that today with personhood theory. So there's an argument that people use that is called the SLED argument that looks at all of the different ways people ask this question. Like, how do we know when a human becomes a person? Is it size? So this is the acronym is SLED. So it's size, level of development, environment, and dependency. So let's just talk through each one of those. Does a human become a person based on their size? Well, if you apply this consistently, of course it doesn't work, right? Because a 3-year-old is smaller than a 30-year-old. But I'm not sure there are many people in the world that would say the 3-year-old has less value or is less of a person than the 30-year-old just simply because of their size. Well, and to apply it totally consistently, then anybody who's shorter than somebody else would have less of personhood, less value. So that doesn't work. It doesn't work. So let's look at the L, which is the level of development. Well, again, to really ask this question, we have to apply it consistently. So while it is certainly true that a baby in his or her mother's womb is at a lower stage of development than the mother, there are lots of people that are at lower stages of development than other people. Again, let's think about that 3-year-old and the 30-year-old. The 3-year-old is way less developed than the 30-year-old. Does that mean the 3-year-old is less of a person? Does that mean the 3-year-old has less personhood or less value? Of course not. I don't think there's many people that would argue that. Okay, so let's talk about environment. Does environment decide whether or not a human is a person? Because some might argue that that human, that living human life, doesn't become a person until birth, right? Well, you're talking about a distance of about 7 inches between the unborn baby and between the birth canal and being outside of the womb. It's really hard to imagine that, location, in other words, the environment that they're in, is going to determine their personhood. Because again, let's apply it consistently. If there's someone who is in a plane 30,000 feet above the air flying to California, do they have a different level of personhood than the person walking on the ground in California? So the environment certainly can't be the factor that tells you whether or not someone's a person or not. So let's look at the final one, and that is the dependency. I think this is one that a lot of people would think maybe is the most powerful, that, somehow because it's true that the baby inside the womb is dependent upon its mother, that this somehow speaks to his or her personhood. But let's apply it consistently. We're all dependent on other people in a certain respect. But think about type 1 diabetes. My stepson has type 1 diabetes. He's dependent on other people. He was dependent on the scientists who invented the medication that is continuing to save his life on a daily basis. He could become dependent if he were to go into a diabetic coma. He would be dependent on people around him to administer emergency care, to take him to a doctor. I mean, we're all dependent at one level or another, but let's again just talk about how even an infant is dependent on their mother for food, for nourishment, for care. Does that mean that the infant has less personhood than the mother? And so I think the SLED argument can really help us think through some of these points. And every single one of these fails to demonstrate when a human would actually become a person. So I think it makes the most sense to say, even from a scientific perspective, that at conception, when you have that unique genetic code, that unique human, that is also a person. And any attempt to try to assign that, nobody can do it. Nobody can actually pinpoint that moment that the human becomes a person, because they're the same thing.